Hello and welcome to this episode of Al's Garage. We're finishing work on our 1943 Willys MB. Now this video is going to focus only on our cooling system. We're going to install a radiator, upper and lower hoses, we're going to replace the thermostat, and then we're starting by replacing the temperature gauge. Now the one that's in there right now is an aftermarket gauge, and it's sitting at about 140 degrees. And I tapped the edge of the gauge face to see if I could get it, reading correctly, if it was just stuck. And it's not giving me confidence that we're going to have an accurate read with this engine, especially getting it started up after a number of years sitting. So we're going to replace that, and we'll start there and work our way around the cooling system. Let's do it. So to start things out, I disconnected the sending unit from the engine block. It was a little tough to break loose, but once it broke loose, pretty easy to pull out and get out of there. Next was taking the adapter off of the block where that sending unit goes in. I tried to start breaking it loose with the open end and the box wrench, and clearly that wasn't going to work out, so I gave it a little more persuasion with the breaker bar, and we were able to break it loose and get that item off as well. Next was getting the temperature gauge out of the dash, which ended up being pretty easy given the fact that the speedometer was already out of the dash. So pretty straightforward process getting that old one out, and then sticking the new one in with the nut that fastens it taped with that blue tape you saw there, but it's just essentially the reverse process of putting that one in. Then once I got it actually in the dash, it was also a pretty straightforward process getting the new locking bracket in there with those two nuts from behind. Just get back there and reach for it, and it was a pretty straightforward process. This temperature gauge had a new adapter which I installed and was able to use some Permatex 2B non-hardening gasket sealer to ensure that it was nice and sealed and wasn't going to leak in the future. So we got that in, and then the final step, of course, installing the sending unit for that temperature gauge. And you can see some wiring that's kind of sticking out. I was able to kind of run that back underneath the dash and tuck it in such a way where it wasn't in the way. This Jeep, since it has the Arctic hardtop and it has a heater, next step was to install the heater hoses. So I used kind of the same process to install those. For each of these hoses and for the heater hoses, I put a little bit of that gasket sealer on just to ensure that it was nice and sealed and I didn't have any leaks. I've had leaks before when I put these hoses on, just because those old output tubes where you've got a lot of rust pitting and stuff sometimes affect your ability to seal, and you can see me putting that gasket sealer on for the heater hose coming out of the water pump. Yeah, and again with this Jeep, it has a lot on it that is not original. This guy wasn't looking for a original restoration, as he's going to be using it, and having that heater ends up being a really nice thing with the hardtop. So we went ahead and installed it from that standpoint. Next is the thermostat. I hadn't touched it until this point, so it was time to disconnect those 3 bolts that hold the thermostat onto the block and pull that housing off so I could inspect it and replace that thermostat. After I did that, I used a scraper to carefully get the gasket sealer and junk and stuff around that cleaned up, and I used an air compressor to blow some of that dust out, just to make sure that I didn't get any junk in the engine block. So we tried to keep that as clean as possible, and so now that mating surface is nice and prepped for reassembly. This thermostat had seen a lot of coolant go through it and therefore was pretty corroded on the inside, but still usable. Here I am trying to work out that thermostat retainer which at this point was pretty rusty. So it took a while, but was able to get the old one out, definitely junk. And you can see all of that rust, which makes me so glad that I went in and did this thermostat. I mean, it's such a small part, but it makes a big difference in your engine overheating and running at the appropriate temperature. Definitely something to address every time you tackle an engine that hasn't been run in a while. The inside of this, again, had some corrosion, and here I am using a screwdriver as a scraper to try to get in there and make sure that there's no particulates that are going to affect that performance of the thermostat. Here I am double checking the fitment of the gasket. Looks like it'll be just fine. And here I am installing the thermostat. Now, one important thing to note, I did drill a 1/8 inch hole in the side of that thermostat, as that will help eliminate air pockets and help it to sort of burp when it gets to temperature. Once the thermostat's installed, it was just a matter of installing that retainer, and it should slide in almost all the way. I'm lightly tapping it with a hammer here. You can see that it's not flush with the housing, but once you tighten down the mounting bolts, it will seat it the rest of the way. From there, we're going to work to install it on the block, and I'm using a special kind of coolant thermostat gasket material to ensure that this doesn't leak or seep or anything like that. So I have it on both sides. I'm installing the gasket on the thermostat housing side, and once I put the thermostat in the location, its home location, top of the block, then I'm going to take the bolts, each of them, and put a little thread sealer on those just to make sure that there isn't any leaking that's going to be happening. So here I am starting to tighten these down. Now, how this engine had originally been set up was that it had the ground cable for the battery on one of those thermostat housing bolts. So I made sure that I had clean surfaces, nice shiny metal, sanded that down, and then installed it that way. But from here, I'm just tightening down in a rotating sequence until it's about, I don't know, 30 or so foot-pounds, and then we're done. Next up is the radiator. I had painted this, but there was still a little bit of corrosion and junk on the input and output pipes, so I was just hitting that with some sandpaper to make sure I had a nice scuffed up surface that was clean, so that my hose and hose clamp and my gasket sealer that I put in there would fit. So very delicate process putting the radiator in the vehicle, but we got it. And then, of course, installing the radiator support. Next was the lower radiator hose. I used some lacquer thinner on each of the surfaces on both the lower and upper hose to make sure that this was nice and clean, that there wasn't any paint or anything that was going to affect the seal of that hose to the different areas, the water pump and the radiator. I'm going to install the hoses now, and I'm just using the old hose as a guide as to where the length should be on this. So for me, I cut it at the location that you're seeing, just very carefully scoring it and then working my way around so that it is a nice clean cut, and then from there I can install it and not have to worry about it being too long. Oh yeah, and don't cut your fingers when you're doing that. Those blades are really sharp. And here I am following that same process with the heater hose, using a little bit of Permatex 2B gasket sealer, which will dry in about 12 to 24 hours. It's just the way that I do some of the hoses on a lot of these older cars to make sure that there's, one less thing to worry about, a leaky radiator hose. The upper hose was a little more challenging because it had the metal pipe that was in the middle with the two rubber hoses. So what I did is I attached and secured the outside pieces first, and you can see me doing that here. And then once that was secured, I then put my gasket sealer on each end of this metal piece, and then, you know, slid it in a little bit further than what would normally be there, and then kind of, you know, slid it back to get it fully seated. All right, there we go. And inevitably the problem with doing this is that you now have this gasket seal and this nice shiny painted hose. So I just used a little thinner to make sure that the gasket sealer was off. I obviously didn't go too crazy on it because I wanted to make sure that the paint wasn't damaged. And then I finished off the installation with those radiator hose clamps, which I'd installed before I put the center section in. There's kind of a process to do it right, and I followed the correct sequence of putting everything in correctly. So just make sure you do that, and then you don't end up with a situation where your center section's in and you're looking at your bench seeing a couple of hose clamps that were not installed. With all my hoses installed and a day or so having passed for all of that gasket sealer to set up, knowing that this is all ready to go, I'm mixing my coolant. I got the Prestone standard stuff that you mix with distilled water, and here I am mixing it up, making sure that it's nice and you know, churned, and then installing it. This, I believe, takes 11 quarts, so pretty straightforward stuff, making sure that the coolant gets in here and where it needs to be. As I'm filling it up, I'm making sure that there's no leaks anywhere from the drain plug to heater hoses and all that stuff. And there's a level where I leave it at. Knowing that the engine's going to get hot, there may be air bubbles, I'll keep checking that as we get the engine started and warmed up the first couple times. But otherwise, we should be good to go. Well, that's it for the cooling system. With our coolant installed, I don't see any leaks at this point. Once we start this up, bring it up to heat, I'll check, double check, you know, for any leaks or any seeping anywhere, if the water pump's leaking, you know, just your final check. But otherwise, I think we're done with that part. So stay tuned. We're wrapping this project up very soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.